What if a major industrial power, one almost totally reliant on imported energy, decided to just flip the switch, go
Hmm.
100% renewable in what, just a few decades?
Sounds like a massive, massive
It
undertaking.
really does. And well, that's exactly what we're unpacking today in our deep dive. We're looking at a specific study called Energy Transition for Japan, Pathways Towards a 100% Renewable Energy System in 2050.
Yeah, and as we dig into energy transition for Japan, pathways towards a 100% renewable energy system in 2050, what's really striking, I mean, right off the bat, is just how dependent Japan is right now.
How dependent are we talking?
Well, this study points out somewhere between 88 and 96%. That's of its total primary energy. It's coming from imports. Staggering, really.
Okay, 88 to 96%. Let's
Yeah.
put that in context.
Yeah.
How does that stack up against, other big economies?
Yeah, it really jumps out. The study highlights Japan's energy self-sufficiency back in 2019. It was tiny, like 4 to 12%. Compare that to the OECD median, which is around 50%. So yeah, it paints a pretty stark picture of the starting point.
Definitely. And what kind of imports are we mainly talking about? Still mostly fossil fuels.
Oh, absolutely. Heavily skewed towards them. According to this study, back in 2019, you had oil, coal, natural gas, making up 88% of that total primary energy supply.
88%.
And coal, even with all the environmental concerns, coal alone was 27%.
Things have been shifting a bit, haven't they? I mean, particularly after the Fukushima disaster. That must have had an impact.
Precisely. That's detailed in this study, too. The 2011 Fukushima incident obviously led to a big drop in nuclear power generation.
Right.
And, well, to fill that gap, there was a noticeable increase in renewables. They actually reached 21% of the electricity supply by 2019, which is, a significant step.
Okay, 21% of electricity. That's something. And how is all this energy actually used? Where does it go within Japan? Does the study break that down?
It does. Looking at the 2018 figures they present, industry was the biggest slice of the pie, about 41% of total final consumption.
Okay, industry first.
Then you had transport at 25%, the commercial sector at 19%, and residential use at 15%.
Right. So, okay, you've got this backdrop. Huge import dependence, heavy fossil fuel use, but maybe some growth in renewables. Now, Japan has set some pretty ambitious goals, hasn't it? The study mentions these long-term targets.
That's right. The big ones highlighted in this research are, well, improving that self-sufficiency number significantly and hitting carbon neutrality by 2050.
Carbon neutral by 2050. That's
Yeah.
the big one.
Yeah, and this study notes the government's focus areas for getting there. Expanding renewables, obviously, but also looking into things like carbon capture, trying to get some nuclear power back online, and investigating low-carbon hydrogen.
Now, I remember hearing debates, especially a few years back, about roadblocks. Things like renewables being really expensive in Japan and this idea that there just isn't enough land. Does this study tackle those concerns?
Yes, it acknowledges those historical points. Compared to some other places, renewable tech costs have been higher in Japan, relatively speaking.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's a densely populated country, so land availability for big solar farms or wind projects has always been, well, a consideration.
But has the situation, or maybe the thinking, evolved on that, according to this study?
Absolutely. It points to recent policy changes, things designed specifically to lower those renewable costs and make accessing land easier.
Like what, for example?
Well, things like potentially using underutilized farmland for solar PV. And importantly, this study really emphasizes the growing recognition of the huge potential from offshore wind
Sure. Right.
and also rooftop solar, things that maybe don't compete for land in quite the same way.
Okay, so challenges acknowledged, but maybe not insurmountable, and policy is shifting.
Got it.
So this study we're focused on energy transition for Japan. It models how this full 100% renewable transition could actually happen. What are the key findings? Let's start with their best policy scenario, the BPS.
Right, the BPS. It paints a really compelling picture, actually. According to their analysis, under this scenario, the energy sector's greenhouse gas emissions could genuinely hit zero by 2050.
Zero emissions
Yeah.
from the energy sector.
Yeah, a fundamental transformation.
Okay, wow. What needs to happen to achieve that kind of outcome according to this study?
Well, a huge piece of the puzzle highlighted in this research is a massive drop in primary energy demand, PED. That's the total energy the country uses.
A drop. How much?
They project a 50% reduction between 2020 and 2050.
50% less energy demand overall. How is that even possible with economic activity?
It's driven primarily by two things: widespread electrification across, well, almost everything, and big improvements in energy efficiency, using the energy we do consume much more effectively.
Electrification. We hear that word a lot. What does it look like on the ground in Japan, according to this study?
Well, it means a fundamental shift. Take the power sector itself. This study projects a, frankly, phenomenal increase in the total installed capacity.
Capacity meaning potential output.
Exactly, potential power generation. It jumps from about 240 gigawatts GW in 2020 to a staggering 968 GW by 2050 in this scenario.
Whoa, nearly 4 times the capacity? Where's all that new power coming from? Is it all solar and wind?
Pretty much, this study points to a clear dominance from solar PV that's projected at 524 GW of capacity and wind power at 344 GW.
Okay, so more solar capacity installed.
Yes, but here's an interesting bit. When you look at the actual electricity generated in 2050,
Ah, the output.
right, the output, wind actually takes the lead. It provides 59% of the electricity, followed by solar PV at 33%.
Huh. So more solar panels overall, but wind generates more of the actual electricity. Why is that? Is it about when they operate?
Exactly. As this study explains it, wind, and especially offshore wind, tends to have what's called a higher capacity factor.
Capacity factor, like how often it's actually running your full power?
Precisely. Think of installed capacity as the size of the engine, and capacity factor as how often you're actually driving the car near top speed. Wind, particularly offshore, just tends to be more consistent over time than sunshine.
Right, makes sense.
So even with slightly less total installed capacity in this BPS scenario, wind generates more kilowatt hours overall. And this study specifically highlights offshore wind playing a huge role, contributing 40% of all electricity generation by 2050.
40% just from offshore wind. Okay. Now, back to that land issue. If you're building out hundreds of gigawatts of solar and wind, what about the land footprint? Does this study address that again?
It does, and interestingly, the study suggests the land required for onshore wind and the big utility-scale PV farms is, well, relatively small.
How small?
About 3.8% of Japan's land area for onshore wind and 1.3% for utility PV.
Wait, combined, that's only about 5% of the land area.
In this scenario, yes. That finding in this study might really counter some of those earlier, maybe more pessimistic assumptions about land scarcity being a deal breaker.
That is surprising. Okay, so maybe the land issue is manageable. What about the wires, the grid? Moving all this renewable power around, that must be a huge challenge.
Oh, absolutely critical. The study emphasizes this. You need really robust transmission links, strong interconnections between Japan's different regions.
So power sharing between regions becomes key.
Essential. This study projects that around 38%, nearly 40% of all the electricity generated will actually be traded between regions by 2050.
Are there specific areas that become the power exporters and importers in this future grid, according to the study?
Yes, it identifies likely candidates. Exporting regions tend to be those with great wind resources like Hokkaido, Tohoku, Hokuriku.
Up north and along the coast.
Right. And the importers, well, big population and industrial centers. Tokyo, Chugoku, Chubu, Kansai.
The main urban corridors.
Exactly. The study also notes interesting seasonal patterns, like the grid being used most heavily in winter, which lines up well with wind generation. And it points to the need for things like gas storage, likely renewable e-methane by then, to help balance supply, especially when wind might be lower in the summer.
Okay, so the power sector is completely reshaped in this BPS scenario. What about sheeting and transport? Those other big energy users.
Big shifts there, too. In the heat sector, this study sees fossil fuels basically phased out, replaced by electric heat pumps, and also these renewable e-fuels.
E-fuels again. For what kind of heat?
Mainly for the really high-temperature heat needed in some industries where direct electrification is tougher, things like e-hydrogen or e-methane. Overall, the study projects less total heat generation capacity needed because of efficiency gains, and heat storage becomes much more important.
So heat pumps for buildings, e-fuels for heavy industry. Got it. And transport, currently so dependent on oil.
Transport sees a dramatic shift as well. According to this study, a big drop in final energy demand there, mainly thanks to, you guessed it,
Electrification.
electrification. Battery electric vehicles basically become the norm for cars, trucks, you name it. But for those harder sectors, shipping, aviation.
Right, planes and big ships.
E-fuels become crucial there too. And this study even raises the possibility that Japan might need to import some e-fuels to meet that demand.
Interesting. E-fuels seem like a critical piece for the tricky bits. But making them domestically, that requires capturing CO2, right? Does the study touch on that?
It does. If Japan were to produce all its e-fuels locally, this study points out it would need significant CO2 capture, probably using direct air capture, DAC technologies.
Pulling CO2 right out of the air?
Exactly. And that, in turn, has its own land footprint. Although the study notes there's a pretty wide range in potential land needs depending on the specific DA tech used.
Okay, so renewables, electrification, efficiency, e-fuels. And underpinning all of this, especially with variable sun and wind, must be energy storage, right?
Absolutely essential. And this study projects a huge increase in electricity storage capacity from about 0.18 terawatt hours, TWH, in 2020 up to 0.66 TWH by 2050.
And what kind of storage dominates? Is it still pumped hydro?
Pumped hydro still plays a role, adapting to support the variable renewables, but batteries really take center stage in terms of output, according to this study. Plus, you get storage capacity from vehicle to grid, V2G electric cars feeding power back to the grid when needed.
Using car batteries.
Oh, clever.
And it's not just electricity storage. Heat storage also increases significantly, with e-methane playing a big part for storing energy over longer periods. Seasonally, perhaps. And electrolyzers, the things you need to make hydrogen for e-fuels, they see massive deployment too.
Okay, so it's a completely redesigned system. Generation, grid usage, storage, everything changes. What about the bottom line, the cost? Does this study give us any indication of the economics in this best policy scenario? Yeah, and this is actually one of the most intriguing findings. This study suggests that the total annualized system costs actually decrease between 2020 and 2050 under the BPS.
Decrease, even with all that new infrastructure investment.
Yes. The key driver, according to this study, is basically eliminating the cost of importing fossil fuels. Fuel costs just disappear from the equation over time.
So the fuel savings outweigh the massive investment in renewables and grids.
That's what the modeling in this study indicates. While the upfront capital, spending the capex on renewables, storage, grids, it definitely goes up significantly. The long-term savings from not buying oil, gas, and coal year after year are even bigger. So it's a crucial point. Huge upfront investment, yes, but potentially lower overall annual running costs for the energy system in the long run.
That's a really significant potential outcome from this study. What about the cost of energy for consumers or businesses, like the levelized cost LCOE?
Right, the LCOE. This study shows the overall levelized cost of energy, including heat, transport fuels, etc., fluctuates a bit but stays roughly in a similar range to current costs. The levelized cost of electricity specifically, though,
Yes.
that initially goes up a bit as the big investments happen, but then it declines significantly by 2050. It ends up considerably lower than it was in 2020 in this scenario.
Lower electricity costs eventually.
Potentially, yes. And this study also points out there will be regional differences in those final LCOE numbers depending on local renewable resources.
Okay, so the BPS, the ambitious path, looks technically feasible and maybe even economically advantageous in the long run, according to this study. But they also modeled a delayed policy scenario, a DPS. What happens if things move slower?
Right. The DPS basically assumes, well, a slower pace. Less aggressive policies, continued investment in some fossil fuel power plants in the near term.
And the result?
Predictably, greenhouse gas emissions decline much more slowly. And the cumulative emissions over the period to 2050 are significantly higher than in the BPS. You just keep polluting for longer.
Okay, higher cumulative emissions. What about energy demand and renewables deployment in that slower scenario?
Also slower, as the study shows. That 50% drop in primary energy demand we saw in the BPS, it doesn't happen as quickly in the DPS.
So you're using more energy overall for longer.
Exactly. And the rollout of renewables in the power sector is slower. The switch to electric vehicles and transport is less rapid. And you keep relying on fossil fuels for heating for a longer time. It's just delayed.
And the cost implications of delaying. Is it cheaper in the short term but more expensive overall?
That's precisely what this study suggests. While the annual costs might look a bit lower initially in the DPS because you're delaying some of that big renewable investment,
Right.
the total cumulative system cost over the entire period to 2050 ends up being higher in the DPS than in the ambitious BPS.
So delaying action actually costs more in the long run, according to this study's modeling.
That seems to be the conclusion here, yes. Kicking the can down the road proves more expensive overall.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Japan's an island nation, land is constrained, we touched on offshore wind, but this study also looked at importing sustainable energy, right? electricity or maybe e-fuels from elsewhere?
Yes, they explored that too. What if Japan connected to grids elsewhere or imported renewable hydrogen or e-methane produced, say, in Australia with abundant solar power?
And what are the potential upsides of doing that, according to this study?
Well, the main potential benefits highlighted are possibly reducing the need to build out the most expensive domestic renewable sources, potentially needing less domestic energy storage and less grid expansion within Japan, and of course, reducing the total land area needed inside Japan for energy infrastructure.
Okay, sounds potentially helpful, especially with the land aspect. Any downsides or trade-offs mentioned in the study?
Yeah, a couple of key points. First, in the specific scenarios they modeled, bringing in imports didn't actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions much
Why not?
because the imports came in later in the transition, effectively competing more with domestic renewables rather than displacing fossil fuels earlier on. That might change, depending on when imports become available, of course.
I see.
And the other big one is, well, energy security. While imports might lower costs, you are inherently becoming more reliant on external suppliers again, even if they are sustainable sources. So this study notes that clear trade-off, potentially lower system costs versus potentially lower energy security or independence.
Right, a familiar trade-off, just with different energy sources.
Yeah.
What about overall demand? Did this study look at what happens if Japan just uses less energy overall, maybe through extreme efficiency or population changes?
Yes, they modeled that too. Scenarios with 10% and 20% lower final energy demand compared to the baseline BPS.
And what did they find? Does using less energy change the whole picture?
Broadly, this study indicates things scale down somewhat proportionally. Lower demand generally means lower primary energy needs, lower total system costs, and lower emissions.
Makes sense.
Interestingly, with lower demand, they saw less need for some of the renewable capacity, particularly offshore and onshore wind wasn't utilized quite as much. And less electricity was traded between regions, suggesting maybe a slightly more localized system could work if overall demand drops significantly.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together from the different scenarios and energy transition for Japan, Preet, what are the big takeaways, the broader implications? Any areas the study suggests need more research?
Well, one interesting point the study makes is that their own assumptions about how much solar PV and onshore wind potential Japan has might actually be on the conservative side.
Meaning there could be even more domestic potential.
Potentially, yes. They also really doubled down on the critical importance of the power grid developing those interconnections is just non-negotiable for a high renewable system. They also reiterate that strategically planned sustainable energy imports could be beneficial for optimizing costs and resource use.
And the bottom line?
Yeah.
Is 100% renewable energy by 2050 actually feasible for Japan, according to this specific study?
Yes. Unequivocally, this study concludes it's technically and economically feasible, which they note contrasts with some other, perhaps more cautious modeling results you might see out there.
Right.
They really emphasize the huge benefits of electrification in transport and industry, not just for emissions, but also for providing flexibility to the grid demand side response. And they suggest future work could look at even more ambitious renewable potential, maybe dual land use tech like agri-PV, more detailed modeling of industry, and the role of CO2 removal tech.
So wrapping this up, our deep dive into this study, energy transition for Japan, pathways towards a 100% renewable energy system in 2050. It really seems to offer some, well, potentially game-changing perspectives.
I think what's really striking, is that this research argues that a 100% renewable future for Japan by 2050 isn't just, wishful thinking. It presents it as a technically doable and economically viable path. The study itself lays out a pretty detailed, insightful roadmap.
And it definitely highlights how crucial strong, consistent policy is, like in their BPS scenario. You need that clear direction. Plus, obviously, massive investment, and really thinking strategically about international cooperation, maybe through those sustainable imports, to manage costs and resources effectively. All detailed in Energy Transition for Japan, Pathways Toward a 100% Renewable Energy System in 2050.
Yeah, and it leaves you with a really interesting thought, doesn't it? You consider Japan today so heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. Now imagine this shift outlined in the study towards renewables, even if some sustainable energy is imported. It could completely reshape the country's energy security, its environmental footprint. It really makes you wonder, what are the lessons here for other countries, especially industrialized nations that maybe don't have abundant domestic fossil fuels?
Absolutely. A lot to think about there. And if you, the listener, want to get at all the nitty-gritty details, we definitely recommend checking out the full study, Energy Transition for Japan, Pathways Towards a 100% Renewable Energy System in 2050. It really provides a comprehensive look at the modeling and the findings behind these potential futures.